Welcome to General Admission, a podcast playing some tunes, talking about those songs, and making you more aware of music that you might have missed. I'm John Krutoff, your loudmouth host, and this episode continues my exploration of hardcore and punk music of 1982 as part of the Hardcore 82 March Madness thing that I did through March, April, and May. And now that it's August, yeah, you get it though. There's a lot of great music from 1982, and that's really what I'm digging into. So, this month, I'm digging deeper still into those deep cuts, and I'm going to use the word deep again, probably in a couple of minutes, but don't sweat it. That didn't make the top 64 songs in my humble opinion. The top 64, if you're interested in looking them up, you'll have to follow me on Twitter and go back through the archives of stuff that I put out in March, April, and May. Look for the hashtag HC82 March Madness, all one word. Or just follow me on Twitter at GENADM Show, and you'll get all that info. Now, the point I've been making over the last half a year or so is that 82 is the best year for hardcore punk music, and that's not to diminish the current efforts of bands playing hardcore and punk rock. Not at all. It's just 82 was just a huge amount of releases that are exceptionally head and shoulders over what has come before or since. Just listen to this month's podcast and think just how many of these songs are better than anything made since. Now, you may disagree. I can think of one argument that can be made that is that encapsulates a year better, but if you've got an opinion, you can email it to me. You can post it up on Twitter. You can send it by smoke signal. I don't know if I can decode smoke signals, but you can get in touch with me. And if I get a great response, I'll read it on air next podcast. And I'll give you your name and everything. You can be internet famous for 5 seconds. Last month when I did this, I focused mostly on the US, as the majority of releases in 82 were fucking amazing from that country. And let's face it, there's a lot of deep cuts. I haven't even gotten into the more punky stuff that came out in 82 from the US that was more veering towards the power pop side. We'll do that in a future episode as well. But while the top 64 was heavily stacked with American and UK releases, and I've already focused on some of the other cuts that didn't make the top 64 from the US, there are still plenty of amazing tracks from elsewhere in the world to explore. Tonight, or whenever you're listening to this, I'm going to explore a little bit more of Europe. This time I'm focusing on Sweden, Norway, Finland, and Denmark. First up, Sweden. Now, you all know Sweden is the home of IKEA and blonde, tall Europeans, but they were amongst the first adopters of punk in Europe, having a whole swath of 1977-style punk bands, which of course inspired the second wave, which were also more influenced by Discharge. So, it's time to get your wig flipped back.
Levande döda, så jag får stenen med mitt liv.
In that set, I played Anticimex, Heroin Adod off their first 7-inch Anarchist Attack. Anticimex have become the poster band for D-Beat and Crust, certainly up there with Discharge and Motorhead as one of the bands that are quintessentially pointed to as one of those. Well, if you're going to say a D-Beat band, you might point to Anticimex as sort of the template from which to draw from. Now, Anarchist Attack was their first 7-inch and features a different singer than what you're likely used to hearing if you've only heard the Raped Ass 7-inch and Victims of a Bomb Raid. In a few places, this record is listed as a 1981 release, but Discogs says it's 82, so I'm going to go with that, and it kind of makes a lot of sense. As the band formed in 81, and sometimes it takes a bit to get going for bands, especially if they record, you're taking up, the first few months of formation. I think, you're probably looking at 4 or 5 months anyways before you get to the point where you actually can record a record. Now, there's some bands that'll be blow that out of the water, but I don't think Anticimex was one of them. So, if I'm wrong, so be it. Let me know in the comments or the podcast notes on the website, generaladmissionshow.com, or get in touch by any of the aforementioned ways that I can be gotten a hold of, and tell me I'm wrong. And again, I'll let people know of the correction in a future episode, if there needs to be one. After them, I played Ladder Nunan Ensam Inat off the Ensam Inat 7-inch. Now, this band sound veered kind of all over the place throughout their career, starting in 79 as a noisier, almost garage punk style, to a more blown out sound on this record, to a mid-80s industrial style later. They also anglicized their name to Leather Nun after the Ensam Inat release to make them more internationally appealing, I guess. And, in the mid-80s, the band covered ABBA and John Cougar Mellencamp to gain some notoriety in Sweden, and guess what? It kind of worked. They did get some UK chart action and airplay from John Peel, so that usually goes a good long way to giving you some sort of longevity. The band soldiered on until the early 90s and then dissolved. After them were Savatage 81 with Snutsflat, who only existed for a short run, releasing this 7-inch, which was re-released with a different cover a couple of years later on Rosa Honung, then packed it in, only to reform sometime in the early 2010s. I was about to say 2000s, but it was actually after 2010, so it feels weird to say 2010s. And they ended up releasing some more stuff, and it's actually pretty decent. The lineup you hear on this particular 7-inch is one that will break up in 83, though. The drummer Marco goes on to be in another band called Chaos Walk, but this time playing guitar in that band. Lastly, I played Bizag B with Riot in the 80s off the V Lever LP. Bizag B got together in 1980 in Galvez, Sweden, which is closer to Uppsala than the capital Stockholm. It's important to note, though, that Galve was also the home of PF Commando, who you've probably heard of. Ugly Pop reissued their 7-inch maybe 5 years ago now. And if you didn't catch that, try and dig it up on Discogs or something. That's a great release. The band dissolved, of course, in 1983 after 1982. Maybe 1983 was the worst year for punk rock. That'd be an interesting thing to look at. Maybe that goes into the memory bank for future podcasts. The drummer of Bizag B was the only person who sort of continued on with music and ended up having a solo pop rock career in Sweden. Kind of an interesting development. In that set was a quartet of bands playing 77 style punk in Sweden in 1982. First up was Revolt with Fritt Spelrum off the Var Blotta Existens 7-inch, which is really Clash influenced, and you can definitely hear that. I think it's really in the vein of that second album of the Clash, a touch wimpy, but still in the realm of punk. I think it's probably, it's probably one of those records that if you like that style, this will fit in perfectly with your tastes. If not, then like if you're a hardcore purist, hardcore punk purist, that is, not a hardcore purist of punk. If you're a hardcore purist, hardcore punk purist, you're going to find that it's maybe a little bit too soft around the edges for you. After them was TST with the song The Clash off the No Teenage Future 12-inch. TST were like the Ramones, where they grabbed their name, the shock treatment, were pretty durable. Starting in 1977, they continued on releasing records until 1988, almost as long as the Ramones, and still played another decade beyond that. Again, kind of like the Ramones. This particular release swerves from speedy UK 82 style songs, think Secret Love on the TST record, to more slower songs like People Dying. I think this 12 inches is underrated. I won't say criminally underrated, but I think it's underrated. I think a lot of people sort of think of Sweden and really, go immediately for the anti-Semitic kind of stuff. And really, the amount of punk that was coming out, even as late as 82, where a lot of other bands might have gone more new wavy to try and cash in on their name appeal. A lot of the bands coming out of Sweden were still kind of doing the punk thing very, very honestly and true to their roots. I think of TST as sort of a Swedish Really Red. And if you know how much I love Really Red, then you'll know that I really like TST. Plus, that guitar sound is so fuzzed out and just great. After TST was Attentat with Surde off the Fagel 7-inch. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce that, but I think Fagel is the correct pronunciation. Again, if not, let me know. Attentat were from Gothenburg and drew their inspiration from the Buzzcocks, which is unlike some of those other bands from the west coast, from the west coast of Sweden. I hear some Stiff Little Fingers in there as well. Whatever you feel is sort of appropriate. But Attentat sort of have that sort of early 76, 77, 78 style of punk rock that you heard a lot of in the UK. Always writing their songs with some melody. You can hear that there's some real songwriting in there. And that's a kind of a real key thing that I think gets lost probably around 85, 86, where bands are trying to brutal themselves and make themselves more harder, and they forgot to actually string together some sense of melody. The band broke up in 1984, but got back together more times than I care to count. At least 3 or 4 times. They released another 7 records after they broke up. The release of Phi Fan in 2013 was their first record that charted, although they had morphed to be a bit more popular. Seems like sort of what happened with Stiff Little Fingers in the 80s, and maybe some of the UK sub stuff as well, that went a little more popular and lighter and more melodic. It makes sense as the world around them have caught up to the sound that they had all along, and it makes perfect sense that in 2013 a punk band from 77 could, finally catch up to the sound that they had all along. After Attentat was Ebba Grön with Heroin Sister and Kontorister, who had a kinship with Attentat, actually. It was kind of a nice pairing there. Ebba Grön are probably the band that got the most mainstream Swedish press, as they had a movie about them, several charting albums and singles in the Swedish charts. And while the band had certifiable tracks in 1977, by 1982 the sound was drifting much like the Damned, adding additional elements, trying different sounds, softening the rough edges of the songs. adding in some synthesizers, adding in some, well, in the Damned's case, it was more psychedelic elements, maybe more gothic elements. While the subject matter was still serious, Evergrande in the 80s was certainly teetering off the punk edge. Certainly not the same band that fought neo-Nazis in the early days. Well, same people, but different sort of sound. The beliefs were still there. The addition of keyboards and horns in an attempt to make a rock record after 1982 didn't help. I think the 82 LP is probably the last stop for punk purists, but the 83 release of Rasera by the band then changed their name to Imperiet, and that isn't, if you take out the fact that, I'm a punk sort of purist, it's not a bad rock record. It's not great, but it's not bad. If you're into rock and you want to hear something that you probably haven't heard before, Evergrande's, well, Imperiet. All right, back on track.
sover och är långt, långt borta från mig. Då börjar jag tänka igen. Tänka på tiden som kommer närmare dig. Och när du blir äldre, vem ska styra ditt liv? Världen skakar när han hör sitt liv. För kanon
right, I started off that set with the Rude Kids with Stadsbarn, the B-side off the Nar Somenan Hitat Tilstan single. Yeah, it's a bit new wavy, it's a bit poppy, Buzzcocks light maybe, but the only reason the Rude Kids get here is their Regara is a bunch of motherfuckers is a great single, and really they're so important to the history of Swedish punk that to ignore them is almost a huge slight. So, of course, by 1982, they were trying to get to rock stardom after essentially hitting it out of the park in 1979. The Rude Kids always reminded me of sort of the Stranglers, including the 80s shift to poppier sounds. So if you like the Stranglers, you'll like the Rude Kids, and if you don't like the Rude Kids, if you don't like this, check out their earlier stuff because it's certainly much more in tune with a punk sound. With all that said, it's not bad. And it's in fact a hell of a lot better than a lot of the new wave that was coming out at the same time. Continuing on with the 77 sounds of Sweden, albeit played in 82, was Zappo with Fod Kanomat, who, if they sung in English, would have likely been on No Future or Riot City. This is the spitting image of UK 82 sounds. Instead, they were in Sweden, and unfortunately, they're somewhat relegated to the Killed by Death Bloodstains compilation treatment. Zappo released a 12-inch and a 7-inch in 82 and then basically disappeared. I grabbed Fod Kanonmat from the excellent compilation Bloodstains over Sweden, which is a bootleg, and I'm not sure that any of the proceeds go to the appropriate people, but all three members of the band met up again in the late 80s and early 90s and started a band called, they didn't start the band, they joined the band, the Sonic Walthers. So if you're interested in what old punks do, check out the Sonic Walthers. Next up was Contact Klim with Calm Igen off the Calm Igen 7-inch. Now, first off, Contact Klim is a brand name of glue, sort of like Xerox is for photocopiers, and that might have been the sort of thing that somebody in Sweden might huff. Not that we would advocate that sort of behavior, but if you do, make sure you clean off your nose, and you don't want to get your nose all closed up and with glue. As the Killed by Death Records blog wrote, well, never mind the impact adhesives, as this is some fine pop punk from one of the first wave bands that took the longest time to get their shit together and end up on vinyl. The boys formed the band in 1978, never played outside their hometown, and spent 4 years rehearsing before they managed to put these 3 tracks on a platter. At least I'm glad they ended up with one release under their belt before they stormed on to other bands. I can't think of a better, more fitting description except dumb, tuneful punk. Last in that set was Cramp with Discipline of the Scratalan 7-inch. We're starting to mind the Outliers, and this record, the A-side is keyboard-led new wave, but the B-side, which I played, is rough punk. And that song makes up for the mehness of the A-side. Almost so different that it sounds like two bands. Leif Larsson, the guitarist in Cramp, later went on to work with Marie Fredriksson of Roxette, who had a late 80s hit with It Must Have Been Love. So it's as schlocky as a pop song as it could be. Like, now that I've put that earworm in your mind, and hopefully you aren't aware of that song, but if you are, stop the podcast, go look on YouTube for It Must Have Been Love by Roxette, and then come back, because then you'll get this reference. And then we can have this beautiful palate cleanser of sorts.
Vapautta mä haluun muutostaa. Mä haluun mellakaan eikä kukaan uskallaa. Enä mistään puhua, ne on koloissansa hiljaa. Mä haluun mellakaan raivottaa. Huutaa pystyy takatassaan. Vaihtoehtomallia ei kukaan halua. Vapautua meistä, niin vain paskaa. Mä haluun melkaa. Raivottaa. Huutakaa. Aiheuttaa takaa. Vittu kaavat. Vapautta mä en haluu muututtaa. Mä haluun mellakaan eikä kukaan uskallaa. Enää mitään puhua melkoloisansa hiljaa. Mä haluun mellakaan. Raivottaa. Huutakaa. Aiheuttaa takaa. Vittu kaavat.
Hey, hey, hey!
In that slightly abrasive set, we went a little bit more north of Sweden to Finland. The top 64 songs of 82 were littered with entries from the UK and US, but third most was actually Finland. Maybe it's the drinking and nothing to do in winter being a perfect catalyst for ramshackle punk, or something just hit the right way. Either way, first up was MAP off with Malaka off the Kasua 7-inch. And I'm going to butcher Finnish because I always butcher Finnish, much like I butcher Swedish. MAP were another hot minute band releasing one record, then disappearing. It's not entirely their fault, though, as the drummer Walter, who has also played in Tervit Cadet, died in a likely drinking accident, but maybe not. Apparently, Walter fell off a balcony and to his death, and so nobody really knows what happened because everybody was drunk at this party. That brought about a close to the band. Now, some things that I've read about MAP weren't that popular because they basically took songs from UK bands and changed the words to Finnish, and nobody thought that that was really all that interesting. I think that's kind of fun, and punk spirit to the max, which is such an 80s kind of saying. But yeah, I think that's kind of cool. After them, I played Appendix with Panika off the Airahau Mun Valuta LP. Appendix are probably the best known punk band from Finland. Maybe outside of Chaos and Tervit Cadet. Probably Tervit Cadet, probably bring it in. But Appendix are up there. They're well known. And having played off and on since 1980, although they took a decade off between 85 and 95, they certainly earned that notoriety, credibility, notice. Certainly if you're familiar with the modern crust from Finland, Appendix are like the grandfathers of Scandinavian crust, and still better than many of the young whippersnappers. There's not much development to their sound over the years. Maybe post-95 stuff is a little more metallic. Anyway, you can't go wrong picking an Appendix record. If you like this sound, you're going to like everything they've done. After them were Tervit Cadet, who, unlike Appendix, were less sonically consistent, but lasted from 1980 to 2016, a span of 36 years. That's a pretty incredible feat considering the Finnish propensity for drink, and certainly members of Tervit Cadet are not immune to that. Now, the band can easily sort of be defined into two basic phases: the early blown out noisy hardcore punk and the faster, more metallic blown out noisy hardcore punk. Either can be to your tastes, but I obviously prefer the earlier, noisier stuff. One interesting factoid about Tervit Cadet is that their strong influence was not felt as much at home as it was in Brazil, certainly influencing bands like Ojo Seco and Sepultura. Now, I find that eminently fascinating, and maybe this is just sort of a Western imperialism thinking pervading my thought process, but I can imagine that, international bands, European bands, talking the proverbial network of friends and gathering like influences from all over the place, totally circumventing the US and Canada and the UK. I love that idea. So as I dig in more, I'm going to hopefully find more of those cross contamination. Yeah, cross contamination. Sure. What the fuck? I wonder if this is also why many non-North American and UK scenes, in developing their own set of influences, I wonder if that's why many North Americans and Western, for lack of a better word, English-speaking Western countries seem to fetishize the Japanese, Brazilian, Swedish, and Finnish hardcore scenes and sounds. I think that's kind of an interesting thing to think about. Maybe when you're on the shitter next. Speaking of shitter, I played Pisa Pasca, which I believe translates to piss and shit. The perfect statement for a holiday-themed record, which is what that particular Tervit Cadet record is. Now, to close out our Scandinavian vacation in Denmark and Norway.
Something in the right, on the baby
I've always felt that Danish and Norwegian hardcore and punk got little attention and it should get more. So first up was City X with Politi Militaire off the split with ADS. City X hailed from Denmark, around Copenhagen, but not necessarily their entire career, and probably had the most lengthy career of the early Danish punk, starting in 79 and lasting until about 85. Then they got back together in the early 2000s to do some periodic shows. So they, came back a little bit. Seems to be a common story among early punk bands. Finally come back together when people sort of figure out your early stuff and start to appreciate it for the good thing it is. After them were the Electric Deads with 30 Years off the Anti-Sex 7-inch. Now you probably know the Electric Deads. They formed in November of 81 and were done by 83. Not a one and done band though. They certainly were prolific, and they released 3 7-inch EPs. Each of those EPs are equally good. There's some people that think that the first is the best, probably, but I think you could throw all 3 down into a pile, not a very large pile, of course, but you could throw any of the 3 on shuffle on your iPod. How about that? That's the modern take on that. And you could get a great song out of any and all of those 3 EPs. There's not really a ton to say about the band. They didn't really, there wasn't much to dig up on them on the internet, but maybe useful to mention BB the singer and Michael the drummer went on to play in a band called Misanthropic Charity. And that band would have fit in perfectly with the UK 82 bands like Vice Squad, Action Pact, and other female-fronted bands on No Future and Riot City. Totally underrated. Now, of course, that LP was put out in 85. So you're going to have a bit of a thing there. The guitarist of the band was Anders, who also played in Enola Gay and this band, Freshly Riots. Now, Freshly Riots were another band who existed ostensibly until 84, but continued on until 87 as Freshly, which is a terrible name for a band, I will say. And they recorded another LP around 84, 85. Hard to say. Some places say 84, some places say 85. After the LP, the aforementioned Anders, who played in Misanthropic Charity with BB and Michael, he left and the bassist took over singing duties. So that's where the Freshly Riots turns into Freshly. They apparently took on a more Killing Joke sound after that change, although I couldn't dig up any of the later stuff as Freshly. So that's something that you may want to track down. I played World of Tomorrow off the Delightfully Fresh 7-inch. And I don't think I would call anything delightfully fresh, but it certainly seems to fit the bill. Lastly was Betong Hysteria with the song Snuten Kommer off the Spontan Abort 7-inch. Norway's sole contribution to this episode, but if we're going crazy with entries, this is the one that's going to do it for me. I love this band and this release, despite the sort of sketchy Nazi Death's Head as the center labels. That's not a John-approved move, but none of the bands were sketchy, and the band certainly clarified that they were anti-Nazi later on when they were asked about it. So I'm pleased with those developments, and that satisfies my need to feel a clear conscience. Again, a one and done band, kind of. One and done, starting in 81, stopping in 83, releasing one 7-inch, but then they went and reformed in 2008 for a show, and then did another release in 2011. Usually when that pattern occurs, the release close to 30 years after starting is mediocre at best, terrible at worst. I had a listen on YouTube as I was prepping for this podcast this evening, and I gotta say, it's actually quite good. Maybe it's just because I really like the Spontan Abort 7-inch that this record gets a easy grade or some sort of pass. I don't know. I will say that Spontan Abort by Betong Hysteria is not my absolute favorite Norwegian hardcore record. Banalist is, but Banalist comes out in 84, 85. And this is a very, very, very close second. We're talking like millimeters if we're measuring things. It's really, really close, and you should do your best to try and download, acquire whatever you do with your music or however you get your music. Try and get this one. It's well worth it. I'm John Krutoff, and this podcast has been General Admission. For today's playlist and more stuff I'm writing, please visit General Admission at https://www.generaladmissionshow.com. That's where you'll get the podcast notes for today's show and other information. If you want to interact on Twitter, it's GENADM Show. If you're old, and email generaladmissionshow@gmail.com. And if you didn't like this podcast, in the words of the amazing Big Boys, go make your own podcast.